Today's webinar is Children Grow in the Context of Their Relationship, Stress, Resilience, and Principles of Child Development, the third webinar of our new series, Building Trauma-Informed Services for Children, Youth, and Parents Impacted by Domestic Violence. Our trainer today will be Susan Blumenfeld, MSW, LCSW, and Child Trauma Training Director for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained in the Using this WebEx System tab in the upper left-hand side of your screen as well. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the center, if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options, but for this session, you will want to select all participants if you would like to respond to a question from the trainer or to contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you are in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on all participants, type in the program you're calling from, and then press enter. Wonderful. So folks are entering some info in the chat. Great. Thank you so much. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly, kind of like now, and it can feel a little bit distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, you can click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you will be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you may call the WebEx tech support to resolve any additional issues. That phone number is 1-866-229-3239, but we will also post this in the chat box. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Susan.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm hearing a little beeping, but I think we've resolved that just now. Wanted to welcome everyone to our third webinar in the series of 10, and so glad that you could join us today. Thank you, Erin, for the intro, and we'll move along. If this is your first time joining us, we have some information on our center, and we invite you to visit us online, and we've got lots of great resources, and we've got a new webinar series that's also on there. So please take advantage, and we're always here to help you with questions that you might have. We start out each one of these by just taking a moment and making sure that we're going to allow space for ourselves to reflect and be mindful of our own self-care. And so if that means you want to doodle, you want to stretch, you want to take a break, feel free to do that. No worries. We are archiving all of these. We're recording them, so you can return to this at any point. Okay. So last time, we spent the webinar really talking about the impact of the work on us. And one of the takeaways was that really difficult kind of place of staying aware, balanced, and connected. And we were looking at how to attend to our own responses and doing the work while supporting others. And for those of you that were live on the webinar and or have since listened to it, I hope that you're thinking about your own self-care plans and are contemplating strategies for yourself, both individual and with peers and in community at your workplace. I was really pleased to see when I looked at the evaluations that a number of you were really thinking about that, and a few of you talked about the fact that you were going to check in with a peer, and that was one of the recommendations or suggestions that was made to sort of keep us on track. It's really helpful to have someone that we're partnering with when we're doing that. So what I'd like to do at this point is to invite everyone to come into the present moment. I know you've probably come in from lots of kind of engaging, maybe crisis-filled work that you've been doing already today. And right now, I'd like you to, in either sitting or standing, get comfortable, but shake out your arms and legs a little bit, just so you get out all the old energy. And if you feel like it, use an audible ha as you're shaking, like ha, ha, ha. So you can either do that sitting or standing. So when you're ready, if you like, you can close your eyes or cast your gaze downwards. If you're standing, then you may choose to cast your gaze a few feet in front of you. And it's helpful for me, and it may be for you as well, to kind of rest my hands in my lap, or if I'm standing, to put them together just below the navel, with hands just resting one on top of the other. And so I'd like to invite you now to begin by noticing your breath. So take a few breaths in and out. With your feet firmly placed on the floor, imagine, if you like, that you are connected to the earth, receiving replenishing energy from the earth and feeling grounded. And then, if you will, imagine that you can breathe the breath of trees, standing still yet flexible in the breeze, taking in energy all around you from the universe. Now, feeling energy from the sky above us, coming into the crown center at the top of your head, and radiating through your body as a source of energy. And now I invite you to take a deep breath in through your nose, clear down to your belly, and slowly exhale through your mouth. One more time. Take a deep breath in through your nose, hold it a few counts, clear down to your belly, and then slowly exhale through your mouth. Now when you're ready, gently open your eyes, and we will begin the webinar. So for today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the protective role of attachment relationships and introducing a graphic called the Circle of Security that is part of an attachment-based approach to parenting. And we're going to work with that some today in this webinar. And we know, and we've talked about a little bit in the first webinar, that domestic violence can pose risks for children's attachment relationships. So we're going to think about that together a little bit, and we're also going to use a developmental lens in our work and talk about why that's important. And then finally, we're going to talk about how exposure to traumatic experiences like domestic violence can create challenges for children at every stage of their development. So we begin by thinking about the protective role of attachment relationships. And I wanted to recap something that we talked about in the first webinar, and you can see I have a not-so-hidden agenda, that since these webinars build on each other, that I'm hoping, and I know how busy everyone is, that you'll have a time or a chance to go back and audit them if you haven't already, because some of the concepts we're going to develop as we go along. But one of the main takeaways from that first webinar was that one of our most important roles as advocates will be supporting children's attachment relationships with their non-abusive parents and caregivers. And we introduced a resiliency-based approach called SAS, and the A stands for attachment relationships. And so we're going to be thinking about and looking at that a little more today. I personally love this picture, and that's why I put it in, because it reminds me of my own experience of parenting, and even before I was a parent, seeing other parents with their babies and seeing that all around me. And there's something really magical when I look at this in terms of the mother orangutan gazing down lovingly at her baby, and the baby gently resting its hand near the mother's face. And even though we can't see the baby's eyes, I'm imagining that the baby is gazing back. And as we kind of then step forward and think about humans and ourselves in all of this, I think about what it takes to really care for and be a protective parent in this world. And when I think particularly about many of the survivors whom we work with, who talk to us about difficulties that they had in their pregnancy with violence when they started to show, many women have shared that with me, and or the circumstances then around how they became pregnant. Often it can be a sexual assault, or there's their birth control is taken away from them by their abusive partner. And so we think about what that whole period of time was like before the baby was born, and what other circumstances might be surrounding the parent as she steps into this role, either with a first child or other, second, third, other kids. And whether or not she had the supports of family and friends and others that were there for her, or if, like many women who experienced domestic violence, she was isolated from those supports and now is doing her best to welcome a new baby into the world. So when I look at this picture, I also think about how we're all hardwired to receive love and protection from danger and harm. We share a lot of our genetic material with the great apes, and so I guess I'm including them in with this, but it's kind of an instinctual, inborn, hardwired piece for us. And so I wonder in all of that, depending on what our circumstances are, and whether or not when the baby's born we have an easy or fussy baby, or sometimes we may have a baby who is really very colicky and is crying and up all night, and we're often unable to soothe the baby in those first few months. So what's the parent or caregiver's state of mind about the baby? And so we've talked about this in the first webinar a little bit, but how we grow and develop is really shaped by our earliest relationships with parents and other caregivers. And it's always in the context of our culture and our cultural beliefs and traditions and supports, our family, our community, and our society. So I think I like this definition that kind of gives the specifics around what we're talking about when we talk about attachment and what's involved. And so it's another way of talking about the fact that how we're attended to in those very early years of our lives becomes a model for our future relationships. So when we cry, are we picked up? When we're wet, are we changed? Are we held and are we cooed to? And do we have lots of rich kind of eye-to-eye and body-to-body contact between us and our caregivers? Or are we growing up in an environment where there's a lot of tension and there may be scary things that we sense but don't understand, and that are frightening to us, and maybe we're not handled very lovingly, and so all of that goes into how we feel about ourselves and what we build as a kind of what Bowlby talks about as an internal map of how we see ourselves and others. And within those first couple of years, we really begin to get a sense of the world as a reliable and helpful place or as a scary and perhaps dangerous place. But we do know that if a child feels securely attached to a caregiver or caregivers, that becomes the most important source for their resilience, and it becomes a tremendous resource for healing and recovering from traumatic experiences. So in this slide, we're really looking at some of the functions that help kids become more securely attached. And some of that's help with managing our feelings that come up and having what's called a secure base. And again, this is not only physical, but it's in this instance, we're really talking about an emotional sense and a safe haven to come back to when we're upset, scared, or overwhelmed. So what I'd like to invite you to do now, if you're able to, or if you've already downloaded the handout, you do have a handout. You can look at it, though, in the slide, but something for you to refer back to. We're going to talk a little bit about the circle of security, and I'm going to skip forward for a minute just to describe to you a little bit about what the circle of security is. So it's really a universal model, and that's part of why I like it, because it really applies to all parents and children, not only families impacted by interpersonal violence. And the other reason why this I think is very appealing is that it's attachment-based or relationship-based. Many of the parenting approaches and classes that we offer folks are either behaviorally based or discipline-oriented. And this looks at structure and discipline, but through the filter of the relationship between the parent or caregiver and child. And today we're also going to think about this particular approach from a trauma-informed perspective. So let's go back to the diagram for a minute. And I invite you to look at what's on the top of the circle. So you'll see that on the top of the circle, if a child feels secure, they're going to go out to explore their world. That might be their immediate world for really little kids, where they're crawling or scooting around or walking. And the need that the child has for the parent to respond to is to support that exploration, to make sure I'm safe, watch over me, to be delighted in the things that I can do, that I'm exploring within my world, and to help me if I get stuck, or if I fall down, or if I need a little help moving a truck or some, a toy truck or something. And then when I laugh or am excited about something, to enjoy that with me. So that's on the top part of the circle. And it's all about learning and exploring and mastery. The bottom half of the circle is about having that comfort, protection from danger, both from without and our feelings within that might be overwhelming for us. And also, you see the baby with his or her arms up, like pick me up, hold me, cuddle me, fill up my loving cup is one of the expressions that the founders of this approach talk about. Help me organize my feelings. And we're going to talk about that a little more as we go along in the webinar today. But there's a basic function here of having a safe haven from scary, frightening events that happen in our lives and with big feelings that we might have. And now I'd just like to direct your attention to the little text box that's on the circle of security that advises us to always be bigger as parents and caregivers, to always be bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. And we know that when we're having a really tough day or if a lot's going on in our lives, sometimes it's hard to be all those things for our children. And whenever possible, and this says follow my child's need. So we're looking at the top of the circle and at the bottom of the circle. And whenever necessary, take charge. So, but in a stronger, wiser, kind way. The developers of this model, Cooper, Hoffman, Marvin, and Powell, did some research with this, but they based it on attachment theory. And what they did was that with this graphic, they really tried to give us a visual about what children need. And this is not only for infants and toddlers, and we're going to look at how that might apply to older kids. And you probably already have some ideas and thoughts about that yourselves right now. It also applies to us as adults and in a somewhat different way, but we're all hardwired to seek safe haven when we're afraid, in danger, or feeling unsafe. And so I'd like you to take a moment now to think of a time as an adult when your own attachment or support system was activated. So that could be it was a snowy night and your car started spinning and you lost a tire and you were on a dark road by yourself. Or it could be, many of us think about where we were when the attacks on 9/11 occurred. And there may be many other things that come to mind. But the point here is that we need, all of us, as children and as adults, need to have our own intimate relationships and/or support system that we can turn to in times when we're feeling unsafe or overwhelmed or in danger. So now we're going to talk a little bit about attachment during that first year of life. And what I'd like to point out here is that so much about that first year is about neurophysiological regulation. When the child's sleeping, eating, peeing, pooing, when they're overstimulated or understimulated, just the parent becomes a co-regulator for the child to really help re-regulate what's going on in the moment and by responding to the child's needs. And from all those moments that take place over time, the child learns to when a parent is saying, I'm coming, I'm heating up your bottle now, I'll be with you in a minute, hold on, mommy's coming. Those kinds of things those moments help lead kids, babies, in that first year to trust that their needs are going to be met and they're going to be kept safe and protected, and that they matter. So now we're going to think about how domestic violence may pose risk to children's attachment relationships. And as I was mentioning earlier, the baby may start absorbing whatever they're picking up in terms of the protective parent's fear or anxiety. And that kind of atmosphere that may be pervasive in the home gets translated to the child and may really impact then their physiological regulation and their responses. And there may come a time, or there may be times when the parent wants to reach for and comfort the child but cannot because she or he themselves are under siege and cannot act as a co-regulator for the baby in that moment. So there's some different things that are really called on for parents and caregivers once the child's mobile. And that's being able to let go and let the child go out and explore the immediate world, but always welcome them back on the bottom of the circle, and helping to regulate that wish for closeness and attachment and being more independent, which comes along with toddlerhood. And if you think about some of the children that you know personally and or through your work, we know that if families have been impacted by domestic violence, toddlers or young children may become fearful and inhibited and don't have that energy and curiosity to go out and explore their world because it's too scary and they want to stay close to their protective parent, a non-abusive parent. Or they may withdraw just into their own world. And you see kids sometimes who are doing more kind of self-soothing, self-stimulating kinds of things, like rubbing a T-shirt and gazing away from others. We also might see at this stage toddlers kind of venturing out without regard to safety. So we know at a certain age, kids start to look back at their parents and caregivers. And it's what we call social referencing. So they want to make sure as they move forward that they read in the parent's eyes or affect or behavior that it's okay. Well, with these kids, we may see a young child who doesn't have regard for their own safety and who starts to, is climbing everywhere and wanting to jump off of high tables. Kids in daycare that are getting up onto window ledges as soon as the daycare teacher turns his back for a moment. Or children that start darting into the street and drop our hands. And at the same time, we may see that parents might have difficulty with balancing this. So if they're fearful themselves about their child because of the experiences that they've had, they may want to keep them close as well. So let's think about this and the circle of security across various developmental ages and stages, and maybe bring to mind a school-age child that you know or a teenager that you've worked with, and think about how the circle might look as a child grows and develops. So one of the children that comes to mind for me is a 5-year-old girl that I got to know when I was doing some services in a local shelter. And I was providing some consultation, and I did some work with parents and kids. And This 5-year-old was very bright, had never been to Head Start or preschool, and the Children's Advocate was starting to talk with Mom about having her 5-year-old enrolled for kindergarten and kind of talking about how that might be a good idea. And the little girl said she wasn't going to go, and she didn't want to go. And as things came out, what she ended up talking about was she was afraid to be away from Mommy. She was afraid that something bad might happen to her mom when she wasn't home, when she couldn't see her. And so this is a way in which that, for this child, she was really feeling worried, and her, that kind of natural piece of exploring and moving and taking that next stage was going to be difficult for her because she had separation issues. And truth to be told, I think that for her mother, she felt comforted to have this daughter, who was her oldest, by her side as well. So maybe you can think about a school-age child as well, and I want to go back and just put the, here we go, and have this in front of us. So going out on the top of the circle looks a little different than those toddlers that we're seeing in the picture here. But if we think about school-age kids, they've got lots of things that they're achieving and doing, and they want us to delight in it. They may want our help with homework. You know, depending on what our family rules are about how we communicate and what we can share, it might be that in a particular family you don't brag about your achievements and you don't talk about it. And so the child might not bring those important things back to us, or if they do, it might be harder for the parent to acknowledge and recognize it. But there's really a need for that, I think, because kids sort of mirror their sense of competence and mastery through what they learn and the appreciation that they get from their parents and caregivers. For teenagers, they're really at a point in their development where home is still a secure base, but they're moving in greater and greater circles, and the way they use their homes as a safe haven looks a little different. So might have a teenager calling home and saying, Mom, Dad, I was telling everybody that I've got to be home by 11 o'clock, right? Or you'll kill me, right? So there are ways in which home is a safe haven, and it may be a safe haven in other ways if really upsetting or disappointing things happen, if kids are getting bullied, if kids are in situations where they're unprotected. So there are many ways in which the circle of security is helpful to think about for kids across the ages, and as I said earlier, for ourselves. Sorry, I hope people aren't getting whiplash here. Skipping through everything. Okay, so now this is the next slide. And we're going to take a moment to think about how parenting might be affected by domestic violence. And I want to preface this by saying that we know in many homes where there's a pattern of domestic violence, that there's very little room for anyone's needs, let alone the parent attending to the child's needs. The only needs that are front and center are that of the abusive parent or partner. And I like the work, as I'm sure many of you do, of Lundy Bancroft, who wrote a book that I think has been very helpful to parents called When Dad Hurts Mom. He also wrote another book with Jay Silverman called The Parent is Batterer, that really looks at some of the power tactics and coercive control that the abusive partner establishes over the other nonviolent parent. So again, we're in an environment right off the bat, where often it's the abusive partner's needs that are front and center. And despite that, the protective parent wants to and is trying to respond to her child's needs. So what we might see, and I think I alluded to this before, if you think about some of the families that you know, there can be difficulties with letting children explore, go on the top of the circle. There may be fear about a child going to school unaccompanied because there's been stalking. Or sometimes parents have talked about the fact that when their child leaves their side, they feel like the child doesn't need them anymore, and they feel a little rejected. So there can be issues that we have, whether or not there's been interpersonal violence in our lives, but that may come up for us. Some of that may be the way in which we were parented and what we experienced. And then on the bottom of the circle, I think one of the things that parents talk about that is really difficult is they may be experiencing their own trauma responses that are coming up for them as a result of the violence. They may feel kind of numb and exhausted, and it's difficult to attend to their children's needs for comfort and delight. You know, they may feel just like they're not totally there and present because of what's going on, and they may not feel like they quite know how to help their children organize some of their feelings, because they themselves may either be feeling on high alert or hyper aroused, or have a lot going on for them, and now they've got a child that's crying or needing them in some ways, and it just feels like too much. And then another way in which parenting can be affected is that child and parent, the nonviolent parent and child, may become trauma reminders for each other. And by that I mean the child starts crying or is having a tantrum, and the parent then starts to flash back on the last time that they were under siege or getting assaulted, and the child was crying. And it's hard then to look at and be with the child, because the past and the present are right there in front of them. And we're going to be talking about and working with this a little more as we move along with the webinar series. Next time we're going to be talking more about trauma responses and what they look like and what we can do to support parents and children. So I'm posing these questions without discussion because we're in a webinar. This is something, though, that I'm hoping that people can reflect on and talk about within your programs and with peers. So what about the intergenerational effects? Because we know that many survivors of domestic violence also experience some form of lifetime trauma, and that might have been experiencing domestic violence as a child, and at the same time they may have experienced some form of abuse. Or they may have been exposed to community violence. So all those things are part of their experience. Then if we think about families who have experienced historical trauma and ongoing oppression or refugee trauma, how might those experiences affect a parent's or caregiver's response to safety and exploration? And how might our specific cultural beliefs also have an impact on how we think about safety and exploration? So last time I invited you to think about creating your own self-care strategy. today, this is going to be one of the first of reflections and conversations for you to take back, if you're interested, within your agency. And so what I'd really like to invite you to do is to look at this graphic and think about how does it apply to your work with the survivors and families that you're providing advocacy services for, counseling services for, or legal advocacy. And how would you adapt it or use it when working with families whose culture is more communally based? So in this graphic, we're seeing a parent's hands on the circle, but there may be many hands on the circle. And there may be traditions that are protective. I mean, when we talked about what the care for a baby, you know, we're not doing that, hopefully, in isolation. We've got supports and folks in our lives that can help us with that. So I also think I want to say a little word about Circle of Security. There are going to be some other resources that I invite you to look at and download if you're interested. So you've got the website link, which is circleofsecurity.net, and it's on the larger slide that's here today. And there are many things that you can download that might be helpful, and I invite you to kind of think, it will give you more of the rationale of what they mean by attachment-based parenting and give you some more depth on it. Circle of Security parenting is also a 10-week model that mental health clinicians and counselors can get certified in as facilitators. I went through that training a few years ago, and it's an intensive 4-day training, and thought it was quite wonderful. And with that training, there are DVDs that can be used, and you can use it either individually, one-on-one with a parent or family. You can use it as part of support group services. So, for instance, if you have a center-based program where you are working with survivors in a support group where you're also addressing parenting, that's something that you could introduce, and that group could be co-facilitated, for instance, by an advocate and a mental health clinician that's trained in this, and also, I want to add, savvy about domestic violence, so both DV-informed and trauma-informed. We've found, as we've trained on this and used it in one of our curriculum, that it's had some broad applicability for the advocates that have worked with families and for clinicians. And I know there are a few programs around the country that are really using this now. So I invite you, if you're curious, to get some more information about this and look at the opportunities and see in what ways it might fit for the families that you're serving. So at this point, I'd like to pause and take a moment to reflect, take another deep breath, shake out those arms and legs a little bit, and I will look in the chat box and see if anyone has any comments or questions at this point. Some of you may have shut down your chat box. If you want to bring it back up, please feel free to. And Jen, okay. So we don't have any questions so far. All right. Then let's just take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. All right. Let's move on then. So next we're going to look at the importance of using a developmental lens in our work with DV survivors and their children, and why this might be important. So the reason that we're spending some time with this and think it's important is that a child's development can be impacted by trauma. And what we're looking at doing is the more we can understand development and provide information and supports to parents, the better able we're going to be to support parents to help their children to get back on track developmentally. So the second handout that you received is on developmental tasks. And we have about 3 slides that you may have downloaded, if you were able to today, already, that summarize what's on the handout. But what I want to point out is that we're looking at 3 really significant areas here. So attachment and relationships with others. So that social piece and that kind of strand and line of development. And the second one is self-regulation, and in particular because we know that self-regulation and dealing with overwhelming feelings and stress becomes very significant for children that have experienced severe and ongoing trauma with domestic violence. So along with that, the emotional piece, there's also how we see ourselves, and do we feel good about ourselves? Do we think we're lovable and worthy of care? That's in the social emotion. It's in the social emotional piece. And then the third one is really in the cognitive realm. So our ability to learn and to achieve mastery of these age-related tasks, and to feel more competent and independent as we get older. And of course, all of these are really kind of, they're building blocks. So if our development gets stalled at a particular point in time, then we need to get back on track. And we might have a 10-year-old who in some ways seems very capable and more independent and is dressing themselves and going off to school, but emotionally they may be really struggling with self-regulation and having tantrums and getting into fights and not being able to learn very well. So what I'm going to do now, because I think I've seen that not everyone is able to download the handout. I think that's true. See if I can move us to the handout. Okay. Nope. Okay. I apologize for that. I thought I could click on it. So this is in your handout. You're going to see these very same things. And I'm just going to make a few comments as we go through this now. In coping with shame and guilt, for kids that have experienced domestic violence and other trauma in their lives, they may feel responsible and feel like they're bad and it's their fault that this is happening. So keep that in the back of your minds as we're thinking about these early childhood developmental tasks. We talked about the biggie of learning self-regulation and modulating feelings, and of course the more our parents and caregivers in those early years can help us on the bottom of the circle to organize our feelings and to be a co-regulator when we're really little, then we start to internalize some of that, and we can do some of that for ourselves if we're not too frustrated or too overwhelmed. And then of course our interest in the world and having the energy and attention to be able to focus on learning and exploring. So for school-age kids, I mean, it really becomes more and more about mastery and competence. And their worlds get larger. So it's not only relationships that they might have with siblings or cousins, but they also start to develop those social relationships with peers. And school-age kids start to have a sense of what's right and wrong. And for some children at this point in time, they begin to, because their cognitive capacities are greater, they begin to start to wonder if some of what the abusive parent is saying and doing is really okay and right. And so you see some of that developing. And the ability to accept some responsibility for their own behavior and mistakes that they make without feeling too bad about themselves and too ashamed. And then that whole strand of becoming better at controlling feelings and impulses. And then beginning to really kind of take in more information and being able to reason in a different way. Oops. Okay. So now let's look at adolescence. So adolescence is a time of real change, and in the next webinar, when we're talking about brain development, we're going to talk a little bit about shifts and changes that are happening with adolescents as their brains are still under construction. But it's a time of really solidifying a sense of who I am and who I'm going to be in the world. There are hormones that have been there for a while, and dealing with those impulses and urges. And then really continuing to have that ability to reason abstractly. And for those of you like myself who are parenting teenagers right now, and to be able to argue with you and debate anything and everything, and to come up with answers that you hadn't thought of yourself. And so it's also a time where teenagers are moving out on the top of that circle. And as I talked about earlier, they also still need their parents and caregivers as a safe haven and a secure, to come home to, and a secure base from which to become more independent. And they really are developing more intimate relationships and social relationships outside of the family, and peers really take on a different meaning and importance to teenagers. And they don't really think at this point, in some ways, that their parents have as much to offer about how to be in the world. People tell me that comes later, so I'm looking forward to that. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is, and you can feel free to review the handout at any point in the future, but for those of you who have not been able to, didn't attend our second webinar, in a different context, we introduced a family, Brenda, the mother, and she had two daughters, her 7-year-old daughter, Christina, and a younger daughter who's 4. And in that scenario, Brenda and her children had gone to shelter, really escaping danger. And we learned that both Christina and Danielle, her 4-year-old sister, are missing their father and feeling kind of sad. And Christina is being very irritable and feeling somewhat angry at her mother. So if we think about developmental tasks with school-age children, and one of them is becoming more competent at controlling feelings and impulses. Let's think about Christina for a moment. So she's in a situation where she was exposed to something that was very scary when her mother was assaulted just the night before. Let's imagine that her dog and some of her favorite things are at home, and she's missing home as well, and she's upset that this happened and that they have to come to shelter. And so if we were going to use some principles of developmental guidance, an advocate might approach Brenda, the mother, and say something like, you know, at 7, it's hard for Christina to control her strong feelings. And you might even point out something from this handout and say, you know, it's something that she's still learning to do. But her anger must be really difficult for you. And at that point, as an advocate, depending on where Brenda's at in the moment, to be able to validate for her having come to safety, and maybe she herself is feeling ambivalent right now, and when she sees Christina's anger towards her, she might be second-guessing her own decision, and it might be hurtful as well. So really empathizing with what Brenda might be going through. And depending, again, she may not be at a point where it's going to be helpful to take in some developmental guidance. So always, I guess the caveat is we're offering whatever information that we have within the structure of our relationship. And so if she is open at that point, then you might suggest that part of our work together can be helping you come up with some effective ways to help Christina learn how to control her strong feelings, and that's something that parents are doing with kids at this stage of their development. And we could work together to think about some ways that might be helpful to make things easier for you. And if she's willing to do that, then there are some self-relaxation and calming skills that you can teach. And again, over time, I would certainly say not the first day that the family's in shelter, but over a period of time when there's a relationship and everyone has a little more space, then maybe talking together about helping Christina to talk about her feelings and express them, and having Brenda there on that bottom of the circle, there to listen and help her think about and organize those feelings by being with her and letting her express what's going on for her and her feelings about the experience that they just went through. She might be scared, she might be angry, alternately. And for Brenda to have enough space to be able to do that. And a little later on, we'll talk about one approach that the Circle of Security folks use called taking a time in, and we'll do that towards the end of the webinar. So for right now, I'd like to do something practical to, this is a self-regulation breathing technique that you can use with young children, but that, for instance, in the family vignette, both Christina and Danielle might enjoy doing this. So I'm going to invite you now to do this with me if you would like. So imagine that you are picking your favorite flower from the ground, and I want you to grasp it with your right hand and take a deep breath in through your nose to smell the aroma, that beautiful aroma of this flower. And once you've really taken that in, then with your left hand, I want you to imagine that you're blowing a pinwheel, and blow the breath out as hard as you can to make that pinwheel go around. So let's practice this now. Take your flower and take a deep whiff of its aroma through your nose in. And now blow that pinwheel. And let's do this one more time. Deep breath in and blow the pinwheel. And we've found that this is a fun and easy way for parents to teach deep breathing for their children. It's enjoyable. Some shelters and center-based programs have actually made flowers out of pipe cleaners and or purchased little flowers, and they've made pinwheels or purchased pinwheels, and they do this together. So I invite you to try this in your program. Okay. So at this point, we're really at the looking at how traumatic experiences may create challenges for children's development. We've talked about this some before, but we're going to look at it again. So the folks for it used to be called the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, but they're the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University, have many, many wonderful resources on their website. And in our webinar next month, we hope to be able to either show you them as part of our webinar and or direct you to the YouTube version that you can get yourselves and look at. But one of the things that they talk about is that all children experience a continuum of stressful experiences in their lives as they're growing up. And so if we, and a lot of the stress that we experience as kids can be positive. So any novel experience in our lives, and as a child, a lot of what we're experiencing is new and novel for us, can create what they term positive stress. So, you know, babies have to go and parents take them for their routine medical care, and sometimes that poking and shots are painful. When a child's learning to ride their first tricycle, or when there's a separation to go to daycare or to preschool or to school, when they get frustrated because they're trying to do something and they can't quite, they've got something in their minds and they can't do it, and they get really, really frustrated, and they're stressed because they want to accomplish it. And the piece to keep in mind is that children aren't experiencing these novel things in isolation, that they have their attachment relationships with caregivers and with parents to help buffer that stress and to help them manage it in a way that really strengthens them. The other kind of stress that they talk about is tolerable stress, and this can vary. And these are the adverse experiences that might be single events. It could be some kind of natural disaster that's really scary and frightening. It might be a car accident. And again, these can be events that the child is going to look to the parent or to a caregiver as their safe haven while this is going on, to help calm them and re-regulate them and soothe them and let them know that they're okay and they're safe. And again, by being able to overcome those feelings, we begin to internalize a sense of the parent being, there are others that are going to be there for us when we're experiencing things that are more than a little bit or positively stressful. And then the last category that they talk about, they use the term, we use the term at our center, traumatic stress. Many of the folks at the center, and you're going to find in the literature, talk about this as toxic stress. We don't like that term personally because we feel in some ways like often we're talking about interpersonal violence, and it feels a little dehumanizing and depersonalizing. So we use the term traumatic stress. And these are events like interpersonal violence, a pattern of domestic violence that's happening in the home, that are chronic if they're ongoing, and that the child and the parent that's being abused or assaulted cannot stop or control. And in those situations, as we talked about a little earlier, the child's primary attachment figure, relationship, protective parent, may not be able to be there in the moment for them to buffer that because they themselves are under assault. It does not mean, however, that parents can't move towards that protective role in the times that they can be protective, and we're going to talk a little more about that. We're going to be exploring this whole topic in much more detail in the webinar in September, where we're going to look at what happens to our own internal stress response system and how young children's developing brains may be impacted by traumatic stress. So the next couple of slides really preview for us some of what we're going to be talking about in more detail in the seminar to come, where we're looking at children's trauma-related responses and trying to understand those responses, both in the context of their traumatic experiences, but also using a developmental frame and holding that frame. So as we look here at the challenges of experiencing trauma in early childhood, so some of you may be familiar with Erik Erikson's social stages, where he talks about that very first year of life, developing a sense of trust or mistrust in one's caregivers. So again, the relationship itself can get altered, and a child's sense of trust in their primary caregiver may be disrupted. I also want to say that when we look at the challenges of experiencing trauma, that we always have to keep in mind all the protective factors that are surrounding and buffering children. So there may have been some disruption in that trusting, secure relationship with a parent who's under siege, but this same toddler may have a very close, secure relationship with a grandparent that is protective and shields from some of these challenges that can come up. We talked before about how a child's sense of autonomy can get disrupted on the top of the circle because of fears about exploring and going out. And certainly those of us that have worked with and known children who have been impacted by domestic violence know that children carry a very strong fear that the parent is going to die or be seriously hurt, or that they themselves will be harmed. And of course, sometimes they have seen serious injury to a parent and at the same time maybe hurt themselves. The next one is probably worth taking a moment or two to talk about, and this is for little kids. Thinking about, so we're really looking in that age range from about toddlers to 3 or 4-year-olds, and distinguishing between reality and fantasy, and having those boundaries get blurred because of those experiences of trauma. And so, for instance, we know that little kids have all kinds of impulses. They've got loving impulses, they've got curiosity, and they also have aggressive impulses as well. And part of becoming more social and having a partnership with others, with a parent, with others, is being able to kind of put those two together. So, for instance, I think many of you, either as parents or in your work, have seen a toddler or a 3-year-old who's really, really frustrated and upset about something and pounds their fists on the floor and says, "I hate you." And sometimes kids may say, I wish you were dead. They don't, at that age, the death is not a fixed concept yet, so they think they can make a parent dead and then they can be undead. But they may have those wishes or impulses because they're frustrated and the parent isn't doing what they want them to do. Well, if those inner wishes, fantasies, thoughts, impulses start to get acted out in the real world as they're seeing a parent get hurt, then those lines blur between what I thought and what I wished and what I made happen, if that makes sense. And then the last part of this is that, as we talked about, children's development can start to get derailed, and they are going to have more difficulty carrying out those tasks, those main social, emotional, developmental tasks, and they can lose skills that they recently acquired, like walking, talking, being toilet trained. Okay. So the next slide is looking at challenges of experiencing trauma in school-age children and adolescents. So, you know, we talked about that those school-age years and teenage years are all about developing a sense of mastery and competence. And if energy is going into survival and survival adaptations, then there's not as much energy for mastering and feeling competent and good about yourself. And because of experiences with violence, children and teens may start to feel babyish and helpless. And in the SAS model that we introduced in the first webinar, we talked about self-esteem and self-efficacy. And so it really gets into feeling like there's nothing I can do, this is happening, I'm helpless. And that comes from very real things that they've experienced. Also, we see that children may identify with the aggressive, abusive parent and try to overcome feelings of fear and helplessness through bullying or kind of bravado, false shows of strength. We've also probably observed and worked with kids and teenagers who we see retreating into a fantasy world to avoid risk and dealing with others. And even though we know that many, many kids who have not experienced trauma are obsessed with their cell phones and online games, we're talking about, in this particular instance, children and teens who really retreat into a whole fantasy world online. And then finally, for teenagers, we may see that they're trying to manage those overwhelming feelings that that whole capacity for self-regulation and the ongoing stress of what they've experienced may lead them to self-soothe through substance use, high-risk sexual activity, and at times releasing those overwhelming feelings through self-harming behaviors. So at this point, I want to spend a little bit of time, because we always come back to supporting resilience. And sometimes it's hard to think about and hold what the impact of trauma may have on children's development in their lives and how they see themselves and others. But we come back to, so how do we support and engage parents to become that safe haven and secure base and restore that sense of safety and a sense of self-security for the child or their children after traumatic experience? And I want to give you an example from a family that I worked with many years ago. And this is a family where there had been ongoing and severe domestic violence. The mother, at this point, was divorced, had a permanent order of protection, and somewhere along the way, her youngest child, who was 3, was at a babysitter's and was sexually molested. And this mother survivor was extraordinary in terms of how she responded to, took care of, and supported her 3-year-old. And with some talking through, I was the counselor at that point in a family service agency. She was able to do the things that she needed to do, and her daughter was fine. You know, she was no longer having to sleep in bed with her mom, and she wasn't having nightmares anymore. And then maybe about 8 months later, I got a call from the mother, and she said, I'm really worried and concerned about my daughter because she was at our neighbor's, who was a trusted caregiver, and it was nap time, and her then 3.5, almost 4-year-old said to her babysitter, I don't want to go down for my nap. I don't want to take a nap, and there's a monster under my bed. And so the babysitter said, well, what does the monster look like? And the monster looked like the person that had molested her. So they talked about it a little bit. She was, you know, really reassured her. I think they stayed up. She didn't go down for a nap because it was too scary. And her behavior started escalating, though, where she was having nightmares again. She was sleeping in bed with mom and would not sleep in her own bed. And she was talking about some of the same things that she talked about shortly after the incident that one incident had happened. And the mother and I talked about this together, and we were sure that she had not had any contact, as we really thought about this, with anybody who might have been harmful or unprotective with her. And what we finally pieced together was that about a month before these symptoms started, this child's father, the former partner of her mother, broke into the house. And it was after that event that she didn't feel safe again. And so in a conversation together, we talked about what this parent might do to help restore a sense of safety and felt security for her daughter. And what she did was they talked together about what had happened when Daddy broke into the house. And she said to her, I've changed the locks. Let's check the windows to make sure that nobody can get in. And she reassured her, and she said, I'm okay and you're safe, and we're safe here. And they talked a little bit about how it had been scary. And within a very short period of time, this child's sense of safety and felt security was restored. So I like to give that example because a child may feel safe after separation, but then other incidents or scary things can happen, and the parent can be there then as that safe haven for the child. The second part in here is really giving parents information about how the traumatic experiences not only affected them, but may be affecting their relationship with their children, and then thinking about what they can do to make things better. And so some of it may be that whole concept that I talked about earlier about parent and child being a reminder for each other of scary things that had happened, that they both were a part of, and being able to work that through, and be able to put the past in the past. And then having that developmental information that we talked about. And next time we're going to look a lot more at that, at having both a dual focus on trauma and development. And then the last piece of this is really engaging and supporting parents when they're ready to be able to step back and reflect on their own needs and their children's needs. And so the circle of security really talks to us and helps us think about what children might need on the top and the bottom of the circle. But it's not in isolation. So for parents to be able to take in that the child has a mind of his or her own, and that their wishes and thoughts may be separate and different from how the parent's feeling in the moment, what the parent's agenda is, and being able to have enough space to step back and reflect on that and take that in. So what I'd like us to do now is go through something that I've heard from parents and advocates has been very, very useful when they've tried this. And it's the concept that comes from Circle of Security called taking a time in. And you can download this as a handout. You don't have to be a facilitator. There are many, many handouts that you can go to, and you've got the website here. So what I'm going to do is just read to you for a moment or two from this particular handout, because I think it's really relevant and it's something that can be offered to parents that I think is very, very helpful. You know, so much of the time when we get frustrated and overwhelmed as parents or caregivers, we want the kid to go into a timeout, get out of my face, be quiet, stop talking to me, right? And we can find ourselves, and particularly if we've experienced trauma, kind of just getting very hyper aroused and upset, right? So what they talk about, it's a three-part piece, and they're really talking about the concept of it's about the bottom of the circle and help organize my feelings and repairing relationships, because I know that for me as a parent, if I'm stressed out and having a bad day, I don't have the same reserves for listening to my child, and I might become really frustrated and impatient and say things that I later regret. So what they say is if I'm upset as the parent or caregiver and my child is upset, start with a timeout for myself, for my child, or for both of us until I can realign and feel bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind. Because often when our children get really, really upset and frustrated with something, we don't feel bigger and stronger. We feel like they're too powerful, right? So it's stepping back into that and then reminding ourselves that no matter what our children might be saying to us or doing, that they, and no matter how I'm feeling or we're feeling, that my child needs me. And so the time out is not seen and taken as a punishment. And I know folks in the Head Start world have told me that right now, in the last few years, it's really become a technique that is no longer used. And I think for good reasons, because kids are falling apart. They really need us on the bottom of the circle to help organize their feelings. And we're saying, hey, go do it for yourself. I'm out of here, kind of thing. So it reinforces a child being on their own with difficult feelings and feeling bad. The next step in this is I'm calm enough and my child is upset. And so then that becomes a time when the parent can take charge and make contact. And they might go from the living room into a bedroom, or some place it's considered neutral. It's a time-in spot where we can sit together and just be with our feelings. And then if the parent can be calm and okay, I was just getting a note, and talk in a reassuring way. And so saying to the child something like, this looks hard for you. Are you feeling mad or sad or afraid? So again, being able to help the child figure out what they're upset about. And then talking about our part in it. Well, when you said that or did that, this is how I felt. But again, staying calm. And then we're able to really take in our child's perspective. If we can't do that, then we're not ready for that second stage. But if we can, we're there on the bottom of the circle. And by doing that, we're helping children build their own capacity to regulate strong feelings. Okay, I am looking at the time. And so I invite you to try this and look at this, okay? All right. Okay, so Thomas asked a question about thinking about the circle of security for adult relationships, elders, supervisors and employees, and combat veterans. And that's an excellent, excellent question. And given the short amount of time that we have, I'd like to pick up on that when, and we'll, you know, the short answer is yes, in a word. But we can, because we all have those needs for affiliation and attachment, and these kinds of relationships get played out in our workspace and with our relationships. So we'll talk some more about that, and I'll weave that in, I promise. That's a great question. So here's a closing thought, that we've got to hold this awareness with hope and all the complexity so that we can really support parents to reestablish a sense of safety, trust, and security in the attachment relationship. And then I just want to direct you, because most of us in our training, other than our life experience, may not know a whole lot about child development. So here are some great resources. The last one, The Magic Years, is a classic, and it really looks at social and emotional challenges that young children face. I love these resources that are online because the developmental tasks that we were looking at were more social, emotional, and cognitive. This brings in physical milestones, language, communication, and I think it's helpful to have this when we're working with parents. So I invite you to look at some of these resources. And then finally, some of you may be familiar with what the Michigan Association for Infant Mental Health has done. They're wonderful because they really tell both parents and caregivers what to expect and what they can do to support children in their social and emotional development. So this is next in our series, and we're going to be looking at brain development and our stress response system and more about trauma-related responses and what we can do to help children and support parents. And now I'm going to turn it over to Erin to close us out. At least I hope I am, because I know that we, oh, thank you. Okay.
Thanks so much, Susan. I would like to thank Susan Blumenfeld for such an exceptional webinar. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Jen Curley for making the webinar run smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the center. Within the next week, I will send you all a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and the handouts that Susan talked about, all of which will be available on our website. I'll also send you a certificate attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, that would be greatly appreciated, and we will incorporate your feedback as best as we can. Thanks again, and we hope you all have a great afternoon. Take care.